sweat stung her eyes, blurring the steel silhouettes 500 yards downrange. Whispers drifted from the spotting scopes behind her. "She's a liability. She doesn't belong." Sarah exhaled, settling her finger against the cold trigger. 10 targets, 1 range record. By the time the brass hit the dirt, the whispering stopped. The air at the Nylon training facility didn't just feel hot. It felt heavy, carrying the oppressive, suffocating weight of a blast furnace. It was late July in the Southern California desert, pushing 112 degrees in the shade. Except there was no shade. Heat waves violently distorted the horizon, making the dirt berms and rusted truck chassis downrange look like they were melting into the earth. Operator Briggs stood at the starting line of the tactical bay, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust. He was a mountain of a man, carrying 220 pounds of functional muscle, built perfectly for the blunt force trauma of Navy SEAL operations. "Shooter ready?" Chief Reynolds barked over the crackle of a distant radio. Reynolds held an electronic shot timer in his right hand. He didn't wait for a verbal answer. Briggs's aggressive forward lean was confirmation enough. The buzzer emitted a sharp, electronic shriek. Briggs exploded off the line. Gravel kicked up in a violent spray behind his boots. He sprinted 15 yards to the first barricade, driving his shoulder into the wood to stabilize his Mark 18 rifle. Pop, 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 pop. 4 suppressed rounds punched through paper targets at 20 yards. He tore away from the barricade, sprinting toward a 180-pound rescue dummy slumped against a concrete pylon. He grabbed the drag strap on the dummy's plate carrier with one hand, hauling the dead weight backward while firing his rifle one-handed. His sheer physical power made the agonizing drill look like a mild inconvenience. Dropping the dummy, Briggs slammed a fresh magazine into his rifle, transitioned to a kneeling position, and engaged 3 steel plates at 200 yards. Ping, ping, ping. The flat sound of lead impacting steel echoed back a fraction of a second later. "Time," Reynolds called out, looking down at the digital display. 1 minute, 12 seconds, clean run. A murmur of approval rippled through the small group of men waiting behind the firing line. Hayes, a quiet sniper from Bravo Squad, nodded approvingly. Carter and Davis bumped fists. 1 minute and 12 seconds on the Jungle Walk stress shoot was blisteringly fast. It required raw aggression, cardiovascular endurance, and the kind of recoil management that usually only came with heavy body mass. Sitting on an overturned ammunition crate 10 yards away, Sarah Jenkins methodically loaded 5.56mm rounds into her magazines. Click, press, click, press. She didn't look up at Briggs's run. She had already memorized the course of fire. Sarah was 5'7". Under her sweat-soaked combat shirt and 60 pounds of body armor, ammunition, and water, she weighed barely 140 pounds. Her hands, wrapping firmly around the brass cartridges, were completely calloused, the skin torn and healed over from endless fast ropes, pull-ups, and the brutal surf torture of basic underwater demolition/SEAL training. She was the first woman assigned to Team 7, a reality that hung over the platoon like a low-pressure weather system. Nobody talked about it openly anymore, but the scrutiny was relentless, suffocating, and absolute. A heavy set of boots crunched into the gravel next to Chief Reynolds. It was Master Chief Corley, an evaluator sent from the East Coast Training Detachment to validate the platoon ahead of their upcoming deployment cycle. Corley was Old Navy, craggy face, faded tattoos, eyes permanently narrowed from decades of salt water and sun glare. Corley crossed his thick arms, looking past Briggs to where Sarah sat. "That's the transfer?" he asked quietly, though his raspy voice carried easily in the dry desert air. "That's Jenkins," Reynolds replied, his tone meticulously neutral. She passed the same selection as the rest of them, held her own in the workup. Corley pulled a pair of polarized sunglasses down over his eyes. Selection is an isolated vacuum, Reynolds. Combat isn't. I see you have her slated to run the primary designated marksman role for Alpha Squad next week in the simulated raid. She's got the highest static qualification scores in the platoon, Reynolds stated factually. Corley let out a low, dismissive breath. Static range is math. Stress shooting under a heavy pack is physics. You're asking a 140-pound frame to absorb the recoil impulse of an SR-25 heavy gas gun, process the wind calls, drag casualties, and keep her heart rate low enough to break a precision shot at 600 yards. She doesn't have the skeletal mass for it. It's not a knock on her grit, Chief. It's just biology. She can't be the shooter. Sarah paused. The heavy brass cartridge rested against the feed lips of her magazine. She didn't turn her head. She didn't glare. She simply applied a half-pound of pressure with her thumb, seating the round with a sharp snap before picking up the next one. Anger was a useless emotion on the range. Anger spiked your heart rate. Anger made your hands shake. Anger tightened your shoulders, which disrupted your natural point of aim. She boxed the emotion up, shoving it down into the dark, quiet place where she kept the memory of freezing ocean water and hypothermia from BUD/S. "We'll see," Reynolds said simply. "Jenkins, you're up." Sarah stood. She didn't stretch or bounce on her toes like the guys did. She checked the retention on her pistol holster, verified the seating of her primary magazine with a firm tap, and walked to the starting line. The dust from Briggs's run was still hanging in the stagnant air. She could feel the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on her back. Carter and Davis leaned against the tailgate of a tactical vehicle, arms crossed. Briggs was drinking water from a plastic jug, his chest still heaving, watching her with a look of mild pity. They expected her to fail here. The dummy drag alone usually added 20 seconds to the times of the smaller guys in the platoon. For her, it was designed to be a breaking point. Sarah stepped up to the line. She brought her rifle up, checking her red dot optic, confirming the brightness setting against the blinding desert sun. She adjusted her ear protection, muffling the low murmurs of the men behind her into a dull, static hum. "Shooter ready?" Reynolds asked. Sarah dropped her stance into a deep, aggressive crouch, loading her weight onto the balls of her feet. She flicked the safety lever to fire. "Ready." The buzzer tore through the silence. Sarah moved. It wasn't the explosive, earth-shattering launch of Briggs. It was pure, frictionless efficiency. She didn't fight the gravel. She glided over it. Reaching the first barricade, she didn't just smash into the wood. She planted her left knee firmly into the dirt, driving her shin against the base of the barricade, locking her skeleton into a rigid tripod. Muscle fatigues. Bone does not. Pop, 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 pop. The rhythm of her shots was fundamentally different from Briggs's. His were aggressive, forced. Hers sounded like a metronome. She relied entirely on the perfect geometry of her stance to absorb the recoil, allowing the weapon to rise and fall back onto the target with mathematical precision. She stripped the weapon from the barricade, sprinting toward the rescue dummy. As she closed the distance, the men behind her leaned forward slightly. This was the trap. Sarah didn't grab the dummy's strap and try to yank it with her biceps. She knew she couldn't out-muscle dead weight. Instead, she dropped into a deep squat, grabbed the nylon webbing with her left hand, and fell backward, using the momentum of her falling body weight to break the dummy's static friction against the ground. Her heavy boots dug into the dirt. She drove from her hips and legs, the strongest muscles in the human body, hauling the 180-pound mass backward in a brutal, sustained leg press. Her lungs burned. The thick dust coated the back of her throat, tasting like copper and chalk. Her thigh muscles screamed under the load, but the dummy moved in a smooth, continuous slide. She brought her rifle up with her right hand, tucking the stock tightly under her armpit. Pop, pop. She engaged the close-range paper targets while moving backward, her upper body completely isolated from the violent churning of her legs. Reaching the demarcation line, she let the dummy drop. She didn't pause to catch her breath. She dumped her empty magazine, retrieved a fresh one from her belt, and slammed it home while sprinting to the final firing position. Now came the distance, the sniper phase. She hit the dirt, dropping perfectly into the prone position. Before her chest even touched the ground, she had already kicked the bipod legs out on her rifle. She shoved the gun forward, loading the bipod feet into the gravel to tame the recoil of the heavy 7.62 rounds she was now firing. Through her magnified optic, the steel targets at 200, 400, and 600 yards looked impossibly small, obscured by the aggressive mirage of the heat waves boiling off the desert floor. Behind her, Corley checked his watch, a faint smirk playing on his lips. She's gassed. Her heart rate is at 180. Watch her groups open up. Sarah couldn't hear him, but she knew the physiological reality of what her body was experiencing. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, transferring the pulse directly into the rifle stock. The crosshairs bounced violently with every heartbeat. She took one deep, ragged breath, pulling the hot desert air deep into her diaphragm. She closed her eyes for a microsecond. Skeletal support, natural point of aim. Let the bone do the work. She exhaled, pushing the air out in a slow, controlled hiss. The crosshairs settled. She broke the shot on the natural respiratory pause. Crack. A beat of silence. Ping. 200 yards. Center mass. She didn't try to muscle the gun over to the next target. She shifted her entire lower body, maintaining perfect alignment behind the rifle, driving her shoulder into the stock. Crack. Ping. 400 yards. Now, the final stage, the 600-yard sequence. 5 separate steel plates, varying elevations, spaced 10 yards apart. The wind shifted, a sudden gust kicking up dust across the range from the left. Sarah read the mirage. The heat waves were leaning at a 45-degree angle to the right. She didn't dial her turrets. There was no time. She used the Tremor 3 reticle in her optic, holding 2 mils to the left into the wind, elevating 3 mils for the drop. Crack. Ping. The recoil punched her shoulder, but because her body was perfectly aligned, the rifle drove straight back and immediately returned to its original position. Her eye never left the scope. She was resetting the trigger under recoil, a highly advanced technique that required absolute mental discipline. Crack, ping, crack, ping, crack, ping. She was running the heavy gas gun faster than most operators could run a lightweight carbine. The sequence was blistering, an unbroken rhythm of controlled explosions and the distant, agonizingly slow ringing of hammered steel. The final target was a small 6-inch plate, a headshot simulator, at 600 yards in a crosswind with a heart rate of 160 beats per minute. Sarah trapped the trigger to the rear. She exhaled her last breath, held it. Crack. The rifle barked. She kept her eye in the scope, watching the bullet trace, a tiny, visible disturbance in the air, arc perfectly over the desert. A heavy, resonant clang echoed back across the bay. Dead center. Sarah immediately dropped the magazine from her rifle, locked the bolt to the rear, and physically inspected the empty chamber. "Weapon clear," she said, her voice steady, barely betraying the physical exertion. She pushed herself up from the dirt, slapping the dust from her uniform. The silence on the range was absolute. There was no murmuring. There was no shifting of gravel. Even Briggs had stopped drinking his water, the plastic jug frozen halfway to his chest. Chief Reynolds stared down at the digital display of the shot timer in his hand. He blinked, tapped the side of the device as if he suspected a malfunction, and looked back at Sarah. He didn't yell the time. He walked over to Corley, turning the screen so the Master Chief could see the digital readout glowing in the harsh sunlight. 58.4 seconds. Clean. 10 targets down. She hadn't just beaten Briggs's time. She had annihilated the standing range record by a full 14 seconds. Corley stared at the timer. The lines around his eyes deepened. He looked past the timer, out toward the 600-yard berm, and finally brought his gaze back to Sarah. She was already kneeling by her equipment bag, quietly reloading her empty magazines, her face a mask of total indifference. "Like I said," Reynolds murmured, tucking the timer back into his vest. She passed the same selection. Corley slowly pushed his sunglasses back up the bridge of his nose. The dismissive posture had vanished, replaced by the grim, quiet respect of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at. "Yeah," Corley said softly. "She's the shooter." 8 months later, the suffocating heat of the Nyland Desert was a distant, almost comforting memory. The ramp of the MH-47 Chinook lowered into a swirling vortex of rotor wash and freezing sleet. At 9,000 feet above sea level, the air in the jagged mountain ranges of the border region was brutally thin. It scraped the back of the throat like crushed glass. Sarah stepped off the ramp, her boots sinking 2 inches into the crust of frozen mud and snow. The twin rotors of the helicopter beat a deafening rhythm against her chest before the massive aircraft banked away, plunging the extraction zone into absolute, crushing silence and profound darkness. Alpha Squad moved out, 6 men and 1 woman, navigating the treacherous ridgeline under the eerie, green-white glow of their panoramic night vision goggles. If the flat range was a test of physics, the mountains were a test of sheer, agonizing endurance. Sarah carried 75 pounds of gear, her SR-25 sniper rifle, a laser rangefinder, a spotting scope, spare lithium batteries, cold weather layers, and water. Every step up the 40-degree incline demanded a conscious negotiation with her own anatomy. Her hips bruised against the rigid frame of her Eberlestock pack. The padded straps cut deep trenches into her collarbones. Lactic acid pooled heavily in her thighs. She didn't complain. She didn't slow down. She employed the same mechanical efficiency she used on the range. She placed her boots exactly in the compacted snow of Operator Briggs's footprints, saving the fractional energy required to break fresh trail. She managed her breathing in a rhythmic count, inhaling sharply through her nose to warm the freezing air before it hit her lungs, exhaling slowly through her mouth. It took 3 hours to cover 2 miles of vertical terrain. By 0200 hours, Sarah and Hayes reached the Overwatch position, a jagged outcropping of shale that offered a commanding view of the valley floor. Below them, nestled against a frozen riverbed, was a sprawling mud brick compound. Intelligence confirmed it was a staging hub for heavily armed insurgents trafficking weapons through the mountain passes. "Set," Sarah whispered into her boom mic. She dropped onto her stomach against the frozen rock. The cold instantly began leaching the body heat from her torso, penetrating the layers of her uniform. She ignored it. She deployed the bipod legs of her rifle, grinding the carbon fiber feet into a crack in the shale to build her foundation. She switched her optic to thermal imaging. Through the lens, the dark, freezing valley transformed into a grayscale canvas. Down below, the assault element, Chief Reynolds, Briggs, Cole, and Wyatt, were already gliding through the shadows toward the compound's outer wall. Through the thermals, Sarah could see their body heat radiating in bright white blooms against the cold ground. "Assault is at the breach point," Reynolds's voice crackled softly in her earpiece. "Stand by." Sarah settled her cheek against the cold polymer stock of her rifle. She began scanning the ridges surrounding the compound, her optic panning in slow, methodical sweeps. Something is wrong. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The compound was too quiet. Thermal imaging showed no sentries on the rooftops, no heat plumes from the exhaust vents of the generators. "Chief, overwatch," Sarah transmitted, her voice tight but controlled. "I have 0 thermal signatures in the primary structures. The compound is cold." A heavy pause hung on the radio. "Copy," Reynolds replied. "We are already committed. Breaching." A suppressed explosive charge snapped against the mud brick wall, a dull thump that barely echoed in the thin mountain air. Briggs and Cole flowed through the breach. Instantly, the darkness above the compound erupted. It wasn't a sentry. It was an ambush. Muzzle flashes stroked the night like violent lightning from a secondary ridgeline 400 yards across the valley, directly flanking the assault element. The heavy, rhythmic, terrifying boom-boom-boom of a DSHK 12.7mm anti-aircraft gun tore through the canyon. Tracers the size of beer bottles rained down on the compound, pulverizing the mud brick walls where Briggs and the rest of Alpha Squad had just entered. "Contact! Contact right!" Briggs roared over the radio, his voice nearly drowned out by the deafening roar of incoming fire. "We are pinned. Heavy machine gun on the eastern terrace. They've got us dialed." Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't shout. Her mind instantly partitioned the chaos, isolating the variables. She swung her rifle away from the compound, elevating the barrel towards the eastern terrace. Through her thermal optic, the enemy position was glaringly obvious. A massive white-hot bloom of muzzle gas, rapidly heating the barrel of the DSHK. There were other thermal signatures moving around it. A dozen fighters, entrenched in a fortified cave mouth. "I have the gun," Sarah said calmly. "Distance," Hayes barked beside her, instantly shifting his spotting scope to her sector. Sarah pressed the button on her laser rangefinder. The invisible beam bounced off the rock wall and returned the data. 840 yards, Hayes called out. "Look at the dust. Wind is whipping up the valley floor. 10 to 12 miles per hour. Full value from the left. Density altitude is high. The air is thin. Bullets will fly faster and drop less." Sarah was already doing the calculus. The environmental factors were extreme. 840 yards at a severe downward angle, shooting through a crosswind in freezing temperatures. She didn't touch her elevation turrets. She trusted her reticle. She found the white-hot silhouette of the enemy gunner operating the DSHK. Hold 2.5 mils for wind. Subtract 1 mil for the angle and the thin air. She placed the floating crosshair of her Tremor 3 reticle in the empty, dark space high and to the left of the gunner's shoulder. She wasn't aiming at him. She was aiming at where the bullet needed to be before gravity and wind dragged it to the target. "Send it," Hayes whispered. Sarah exhaled, finding the natural respiratory pause. The cold vanished. The noise of the radio vanished. There was only the bone of her skeleton supporting the rifle and the precise half-pound wall of the trigger. She broke the shot. Crack. The heavy 7.62mm round left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second. The suppressor mitigated the flash, but the recoil punched violently into Sarah's shoulder. Because her body was perfectly aligned behind the gun, the rifle tracked straight up and straight down. She never lost sight of the target in her scope. It took nearly a full second and a half for the bullet to cross the valley. Through the thermal optic, Sarah watched the gunner's heat signature abruptly fold backward, collapsing away from the heavy machine gun. "Impact," Hayes confirmed coldly. "Gunner down." But the respite lasted only 3 seconds. Another white-hot figure scrambled over the rocks, instantly grabbing the spade grips of the DSHK. The heavy weapon roared to life again, ripping the roof off the structure where Briggs was taking cover. "They're swarming it," Hayes said. 5 more dismounts moving down the terrace to flank the chief. "I see them," Sarah replied. This wasn't a single sniper shot anymore. This was a geometry of suppression. She had to break their momentum. Sarah shifted her hips slightly, aligning her natural point of aim with the new gunner. She cycled her breathing. Crack, a 1.5-second delay. The new gunner slumped forward over the weapon. She immediately traversed the rifle to the right, picking up the line of insurgents moving down the goat path to flank the assault element. They were moving targets. The math was infinitely harder. She tracked the lead fighter, matching his speed with her crosshairs. Calculate the lead, account for the wind, brake, crack. The lead fighter dropped. Crack. The man behind him stumbled and fell. "Keep hitting them, Overwatch," Briggs yelled over the radio, the sound of falling masonry crashing in the background. "They're backing off the gun." Down in the valley, the enemy realized they were being hunted from the sky. The thermal blooms of the fighters scattered, diving behind boulders and trench lines. Suddenly, the shale rock 5 feet to Sarah's left exploded in a shower of sparks and jagged stone. Zing crack. The supersonic crack of incoming rounds echoed a split second later. An insurgent sniper with an SVD rifle had spotted their position. "Incoming! Sniper on the lower ridge, 600 yards, Hayes yelled, ducking his head behind the optic. Sarah didn't pull her face off the gun. The survival instinct screams at the human body to compress, to hide, to seek cover when under fire. Sarah fought the biology. If she stopped shooting, Briggs and Reynolds would die in the compound. She tracked her optic down to the lower ridge, a faint thermal bloom peeking around a boulder. A muzzle flash stroked the dark. Snap. A bullet hissed inches over her helmet, throwing a spray of frozen dirt across the back of her neck. She didn't blink. She held 1.2 mils for wind. Crack. The thermal bloom behind the boulder jerked violently and slid down out of view. "Target neutralized," Hayes breathed, his voice thick with adrenaline. Sarah went back to the terrace. The DSHK remained unmanned, the dead gunners draped over the rocks. But there were still fighters attempting to maneuver. For the next 12 minutes, Sarah Jenkins became a machine of absolute, terrifying efficiency. She methodically scanned, calculated, and fired. She was running the heavy gas gun with the exact same metronomic rhythm she had used in the desert heat of Nyland. But now, her targets were shooting back. She managed her ammunition perfectly. She communicated her reloads to Hayes. She never raised her voice. She never let the panic of the incoming fire disrupt her heart rate. Crack, crack, crack. By the time she dropped her empty magazine into the frozen dirt and locked a fresh one into the magwell, the valley was silent. The thermal landscape was still. The DSHK was abandoned. 10 distinct heat signatures lay motionless across the terraced ridgeline. 10 targets. The radio clicked. Chief Reynolds's voice came through, panting heavily. "Overwatch. Assault element is breaking contact. We have the HVI moving to primary exfil point. Good shooting up there, Jenkins." "Copy, Chief. We have you covered." Sarah kept her eye in the scope for another 45 minutes, her finger resting just outside the trigger guard, until the assault element was safely aboard the extraction bird. Only when the radio signaled all secure did she finally power down her optic and safe her weapon. Her hands were entirely numb. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull, bruised ache from the sustained recoil. When she stood up, her knees popped loudly in the cold. The flight back to the staging base was a dark, quiet blur of vibration and exhaustion. When the Chinook finally set down on the tarmac at Bagram, the squad filed out into the biting wind. The adrenaline was leaving their systems now, replaced by the heavy, leaden weight of survival. Inside the locker room, the smell of cordite, sweat, and wet gear was overpowering. Nobody spoke as they unbuckled their armor and racked their weapons. Sarah stood by her cage, pulling the heavy plate carrier over her head. Her uniform beneath was soaked in cold sweat. She leaned against the metal locker for a fraction of a second, closing her eyes, allowing herself a single, deep, shuddering breath. A heavy shadow fell over her bench. She opened her eyes. Briggs was standing there. The massive operator looked exhausted, his face smeared with camouflage paint and concrete dust from the shattered walls of the compound. His plate carrier was scuffed and his knuckles were bleeding. He didn't offer a high five. He didn't offer a flowery speech about how she proved them wrong. In this world, survival wasn't a movie. It was a transaction. Briggs reached into his cargo pocket, pulled out a lukewarm plastic bottle of water, and held it out to her. Sarah looked at the water, then up at Briggs. "Good comms up there," Briggs said quietly, his deep voice scraping like sandpaper. "You kept us breathing." Sarah took the bottle. She unscrewed the cap and took a slow drink. "Just doing the math, Briggs," she replied softly. Briggs nodded once, a slow, deliberate tilt of his chin. The pity he had looked at her with on the Nyland Range 8 months ago was completely gone, replaced by the unbreakable, quiet recognition of a peer. He turned and walked back to his locker. Sarah wiped the water from her mouth, picked up her rifle, and began to strip it down for cleaning. The range record didn't matter. The whispers didn't matter. She was the shooter. And tomorrow, there would be more work to do. Did the raw intensity of Sarah's overwatch leave you breathless? True combat effectiveness isn't about size or ego. It's about flawless execution, tactical intellect, and possessing the ice-cold discipline to do the math while under fire. If you felt the adrenaline of this grounded, high-stakes story and want to see more tactical narratives that honor true grit, smash that like button, share this video with your crew, and subscribe to the channel. Stay dangerous and stay sharp.